Hello and welcome to World Talks with me, Ashim Kumar. The United States has imposed new tariffs on imports from 60 trading partners, including the European Union, while Brussels has also agreed on its 21st sanctions package against Russia. Is Europe facing a growing economic pressure from both Washington and Moscow at the same time? Well, we're joined by Tomasz Włostowski, managing partner at EU Strategies and a regular contributor. Tomasz, welcome back. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So these new tariffs that the US is imposing on the EU, how significant are they? I mean, 10 to 12%, something like that.
Well, to be very honest, they're not. They're not. This is not a serious issue overall. I mean, I think we have to sort of zoom out and look at the U.S. trade policy in a broader context. I think the EU and EU business has realized a while back that the U.S. Tariff policy is going to be unpredictable, that President Trump is determined to impose tariffs on the EU and on the entire world, and that he's going to do whatever he can to keep the tariffs that he imposed previously, but that were ruled by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, intact. So, we have a deal with the Americans that essentially they're not going to surpass 15% of tariffs on EU exports. And, the U.S. administration is going to be looking for various legal reasons to keep them intact. The latest one, the one you mentioned, the fact that EU doesn't have supposedly, effective rules against forced labor products. That's entirely not true. But I think Europeans have resigned themselves to the fact that, Americans are going to have tariffs on EU exports, and we just have to basically wait until the Trump administration is out. So from a business perspective and a political perspective, I think the latest tariffs just caused a shrug in Brussels, and things continue as they were.
Right. I mean, it certainly sounds that way. It sounds as though that it was expected, and the EU approached this, or Brussels approached this, as a kind of a negotiation. So yes, let's negotiate on some sectors and perhaps protect others. Does that kind of fairly sum it up?
I think it does, and I'm sort of curious to see whether Brussels and Commission in particular will try to contest or raise concerns about the sort of the legal background for these tariffs. Again, the formal reason, it's sort of called a Section 301 investigation by USTR, claiming that a number of countries, including the EU, do not have effective provision against forced labor products. That's not true. We do have a regulation. It's also a fact, it's still sort of in the implementation phase. It has already entered into force, but we're not actually enforcing it until December of 27. So it's true we're not doing it now, but we have regulations in place. So US findings are not exactly true. But then at the same time, we've already agreed with Americans that they can impose tariffs up to 15%. So in essence, is this legal basis going to be used or some other one? I don't think Brussels really cares that much, and yes, I think we've resigned themselves to the tariffs being enforced, and there is going to be, of course, an analysis, as you suggest, of what tariffs, of what the product lists are, and which sectors are going to get hit. But overall, this is not a major issue.
OK, storm in a teacup when it comes to tariffs. What about sanctions? 21st package of sanctions just approved by the Commission. Many people, as is to be expected, are saying, well, didn't really go far enough. And it's a fair question. I mean, why has it taken 21 sets of sanctions to take action against Russian banks, for example?
Well, look, a couple of issues. So first of all, we've taken actions against Russian banks long before. We've added new ones to the list. We're adding over 30 sort of mostly regional banks to the list. So the list of Russian banks sort of completely excluded from SWIFT and from any dealings with Europe is quite impressive by now. But we've done this before. I think it is a fact that this sanctions package is not relatively very far-reaching, and I think this sort of raises a question of why did the EU I would say, succumb or give in to the blackmail by the Greeks, who have essentially forced a major exemption in the sanctions package for its LNG shipments from Russia to third countries. Because we can look at the sanctions package from two perspectives. One is what's in it, what's not in it, and why is it that weak. So that's the first aspect of it. But there's another one, and I think that's the more important one, which is the fact that we are facing more and more opposition from member states, and member states are increasingly using the unanimity required for sanctions to extract increasingly important exemptions and concessions. And I think the second aspect is actually more worrying.
Well, certainly. I mean, before Orban's departure, Hungary was the fly in the ointment, if I can put it like that. Does Greece seem to be stepping in those shoes?
Well, I think this is a particular situation which actually makes it more that concerning, at least for me, because with Orban you sort of understood what's behind it, right? I mean, he was essentially trading off some favors with the Russians. I think we can say that openly. Whenever the Commission proposed some tariffs, Orban would get some indication of what the Russians were out, and then he would use his veto to ensure that some of the most egregious things or some of the most important things would get off the list. So I think that was expected. People understood how that's played and dealt with it. And now we have something more worrying, I think, because we have a situation where, so let's just maybe back up for your viewers. We have a situation where the EU had imposed sanctions already on LNG imports into the EU, and also on LNG shipments from Russia to third countries. And then after the fact, because this was the 19th package, two rounds later, the Greek government wakes up that, oh, wait a minute, we have a firm that's actually, servicing some of these exports to third countries of LNG, and we would like the existing sanctions changed because we're going to block this 21st round. So we have a situation where the government is actually blocking the sanctions to ensure that one of its companies gets exempted and gets to continue doing business with the Russians, something that was already forbidden. And I think this is the more worrying sign because, we have 27 member states. All of them have taken a hit. Let's be honest about it. Imposing sanctions, as you've suggested at the beginning, what is the impact on Russian economy is one question, but what is the impact on European economy is the second question. And a lot of every export ban, every freeze of transactions with the Russians costs Europe as well. I mean, we're not only imposing costs on the Russians, we're also imposing costs on ourselves. So every member state has already suffered these consequences. So now for one member state to say, well, actually, I want my company out because, they've contracted shipments from Russia and we don't want their commercial interests being hurt, I think that just sends a very devastating signal to the rest of the countries who just learned, well, no, the next sanctions round comes about. This is what we're going to do to protect our industries. This is not a good signal for the future.
Well, certainly. I mean, there seem to be two elements to this. The first is the unanimity rule, and the second is, any country can then kind of dig its heels in, as Greece did, and say, sorry, but we're not taking that hit. I mean, is this further evidence that the EU needs to rethink the way in which such decisions are made?
Well, Jim, yes, but I think this is the big problem we're facing, which is these discussions on unanimity. They have been ongoing, ever since the Orban sort of vetoes that you've mentioned earlier. But the fact is, this would require a change of treaties, so we're not really going anywhere. We're not going in that direction, I think, anytime soon, because as you know and your viewers know, we have there is a big sort of political debate in Europe over the direction of a number of policies, climate, competitiveness, the role of fossil fuels, and so on. So, changing treaties right now is probably not something that a lot of people in Brussels or capitals would be looking forward to. But I think there is a discussion and there is a lot of conceptual thinking over how to change our sort of sanctions approach to sanctions, or what other instruments can we use? Can we do things at the national level? Can we maybe use different procedures in Europe to circumvent the unanimity requirement? And I'll just give you a couple of examples, we were slowly moving towards trade measures instead of sanctions. And we've seen this, for example, with very high tariffs on Russian fertilizers imposed a while back. We've also seen it with the ban on importation of Russian gas. Also adopted not that long ago. So we see measures which are not technically sanctions. They're sort of trade measures or energy measures, which don't require unanimity, but are imposed through qualified majority. So one country cannot block it. So there is some thinking in that direction, but to change the overall sanctions rule, that's going to be extremely difficult.
So there is some leeway. Tomasz Włostowski, thank you as always for sharing your analysis with our audience, and have a good day.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.